Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas and to Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. We are diving into the literature. This is part of the literature series that we do together. We are diving into Faust, and Phil is going to be leading this charge. So let me hand it over to Phil. Phil?
Thank you, Shrikant. Yes, welcome everyone to this new adventure. I'm very excited, almost as excited as when we did Dante, which I think most of you enjoyed, and I got some good feedback from that. So we're going to do something very similar with Faust. We're going to try to cover the entire 2 parts in about 10 sessions, including this one. And this session is going to be a little bit different just because we're starting out. And what I like to do in the beginning of these enterprises, new enterprises, is to just to situate everybody. I know a lot of you already know a lot of these things, so I apologize in advance if I say something that you already know, but I want to make sure that everybody's sort of on the same level playing field. And so we want to just spend a couple of brief moments to paint the big picture. And what I'm going to use as a point of departure for this is I'm going to start out a little bit in the left field out here and hopefully make it back to the historical context, say a few words about Goethe himself and about Faust in general. So where I want to start is with a completely different author, Oswald Spangler. And I don't know if you're familiar with him. He wrote a seminal work called The Decline of the West. And in this book, he proposes a theory of history, world history, where he discusses some of the pitfalls of the current approach, which again, most of us, we have learned this in school with, the kind of the division of the antiquity, the middle period, Middle Ages, and kind of the new modern history. And Spangler says, no. What actually is happening is we have different civilizations that are organic and they grow like organic beings, kind of like plants or animals, and they have their birth, their flourishing and decline. And the ones that are of particular interest to us are 3 civilizations that he points out, and they are the Apollonian or Apollonian, probably is the term that makes most sense to us, which is the classical antiquity. Then followed by what he calls the Magian or the mystical culture, which encompasses everything up to about 1000 AD. And then the next period he calls the Faustian period, Faustian civilization. And this is where I want to make the connection. Why does he make this break? And he thinks that we've entered upon a period in history which is completely different than all the other periods, and the civilization that we're currently in, the Western European, or just what we call the Western world, the civilization that we're in is a unique civilization. And of course, he calls it Faustian. So that brings us back to Goethe's Faust. Spangler describes this Faustian age as an age of infinite possibilities, limitless. And this is particularly pertinent to probably to the United States, America, as the land of the unlimited possibilities. We've all kind of been raised in the spirit of anything is possible. And so I think this is going to be very pertinent to us, this discussion on Faust and his ideas. And then we can go back perhaps at the end to say, was Spengler right to characterize our age as the Faustian age? Do you agree with that or not? Depending on what, your views on the book as we read it. So this is the connection. Faust is obviously seminal to our understanding of our own world because it touches on questions of meaning, questions of knowledge. If you remember, he trades his soul for the promise of experiencing life to its fullest and promise of knowledge, real knowledge. And we can talk about as we read about the bargain, was it worth it? And of course, what he is supposed to pay with is his own soul. Now, I'm not going to ruin the book for you, but we can talk about whether or not this payment was worth it. let's talk about, switch gears a little bit and talk about the historical setting for this book. So last time we did this, we talked about Dante, and we were in the Middle Ages. We talked about the medieval mindset, and obviously a lot has happened since then. We've had the scientific revolution. We've had the rise of a completely different approach to understanding the world around us. Francis Bacon famously popularized the idea of using experimentation, an empirical approach to understand nature versus the scholastic approach, which is using logic and kind of trying to deduce from first principles the truths of universal importance. We have had Galileo, Copernicus, Newton. They've completely uprooted the old Ptolemaic world system that was kind of married to the biblical system of the heavens being static and all these perfect circles and so forth. So all that has been uprooted. We've had enlightenment with Voltaire criticizing religion in general and being very kind of resurfacing skepticism as a legitimate way of understanding the world, and criticizing powers that be and so forth, criticizing authority, and his famous dictum of dare to think for yourself, right? And then we had Rousseau with this idea of, again, making rational basis for education and for culture. And of course, the French Revolution was the epitome of expressing all of that. And that happened right, I guess, when Goethe was he was born in 1849. So he was in his prime at that time. And all these things were happening in Europe at this very same time. So another, from a cultural perspective, as Goethe was growing up, there was already a reaction to this obsession with the scientific method and obsession with neoclassicism and its kind of canon, the strict canon of what is beautiful, what is proper, etc. And this movement, of course, is known as the Romanticism movement in literature. And that's the setting, I guess, of ideas that Goethe found himself in. Now, let me share my screen, and I have a nice couple of portraits of him that I want to share. If I can share my screen real quick. Let's see here. And can you see this, guys? Yep. Okay. Perfect. So these are a couple of portraits of Goethe. As I said, he was born in 1749, born in a German town of Frankfurt on the Main. Not a particularly important town, but he was born in a well-to-do family. His father was a lawyer, not a practicing, well, not an important person necessarily in the social fabric of that town, but he was a well-to-do person, and he was able to give Goethe really solid education, hired private tutors. So Goethe learned to speak like 5 different languages in his youth already. He learned Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, English, just to get started. And beyond that, he was reared in a sort of like a aristocratic type of upbringing. So he learned how to draw, he learned fencing, writing, just a lot of different, very rounded and complete education, if you will. He followed his father's footsteps originally, went to University of Leipzig to study law, got disillusioned with that pretty quickly, did not really take to that. He did join a club of emergent romantic movement at that time called Sturm und Drang, which means tempest and revolt. Maybe it could be translated as that, which is basically, you can kind of tell by the name that it's talking about revolting against certain canons and certain prescriptions that were passed down at the time. Quickly gained fame after he published his first important work, Young Werther's Sorrows, which is a story of a young man who eventually experiences unrequited love and eventually commits suicide. Very romantic story, and it really put him on the map of a literary map of Europe. This was one of the favorites of Napoleon, is my understanding, and he also gained an entrance into a court of a young duke, Karl August, who was a duke of the small republic, Weimar Republic in Germany. And this gained Goethe access to all kinds of resources. He was basically a prime minister to this duke, who himself was, by the way, a very young man. He was only 18 when he invited Goethe to his court. So it was an amazing time. You know, these young men, Goethe is advising him. And of course, this is all relevant to Faust as a story, because in part 2, you will see Faust kind of fulfilling that same function with this character, the emperor. So we can obviously trace some of his own experience into the book, which is, again, very interesting, because Goethe believed that in order to understand something, you can't just study it, you have to experience it. That was his big idea when he studied just about everything. It was, he said you cannot, he really pushed back against the analytic method of studying things by breaking them into parts. He believed that you have to immerse yourself and understand kind of the systemic, gain a systemic understanding of something in order to really understand it. And that, by the way, led him to all kinds of scientific inquiries into botany, mineralogy, geology. He wrote this treatise on the Metamorphosis of Plants, which was a very interesting idea about how plants really are adaptations or changes of the same fundamental unit, the leaf. He thought the leaf was the fundamental unit of plant life. And in general, he's considered the father of this branch of science called morphology and comparative morphology, and also homology, which again, this was all new. And was considered to have contributed to the modern theory of evolution in that regard. So a very brilliant man, a polymath by any measure. Okay, so now switching back to Faust itself. What is Faust? What is this story? So the prototype for Goethe's Faust actually is probably a historical figure, lived around 1480s in Germany, studied at Wittenberg, was a doctor of divinity, and is said to have had interest in alchemy, in conjuring up spirits, and very quickly legends spread about him that became very popular, that he sold his soul to the devil, and in return he gained some magical abilities that he used to mostly to amuse himself. It wasn't a very deep story. In 1587, there's an first official publication of Dr. Faustus' life, or I think it's called the History of the Damnable Dr. Faustus by John Spees. And afterwards, about a year afterwards, we have a beautiful retelling of that by Christopher Marlowe in his Dr. Faustus, which I highly recommend that you read as you read Goethe's Faust, because it's very short, but it gives you the same, it gives you a really great comparison of how Marlowe treats Faustus and how Goethe does, because they do treat him differently. And then, of course, Goethe picked up on these legends. A lot of them were performed as plays in different towns. And so the theme was very popular. But Goethe takes that theme, the general premise of it, and he transforms it into a truly philosophical work, a truly seminal work that tries to answer not just questions of what does a person do with some magical powers, but what is really, I mean, it's fundamental questions like what is the meaning of life? What would bring satisfaction to a person? What is the place of a person in society? I mean, there's just so many questions, including this tension between classical and modern learning, and the place of antiquity, the place of tradition, and the place of science and religion and magic and nature. I mean, it's just all these threads. He takes them and he, using his amazing erudition into all these topics and his own experience as a person who had opportunity to actually be part of a governing body, he takes that and brings it all together in a beautiful verse. So that's the intro to Faust. I'm going to stop at this point. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the intro and the dedication and the intro sections, which we're going to discuss today. But then I want to hand it back to Shrikant and our panelists, who can then augment what I just said with their own insights. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up, so folks, I'm going to first call on our panelists to talk about their take on Faust. And by the way, the idea of panelist is just anybody who is deeply diving into the work in trying to figure it out. It doesn't matter what's your level of knowledge. So if you'd like to become a panelist, you're welcome to contact me. All it means is that panelists get to go first in giving their comments. So now I'm going to open it up for any general comments on Goethe and Faust. We're going to start with Doug, and then Maritza, and then Allison. Give me just a second. Yes, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to leave this. I didn't find out about this until last week, and I read this section again, but I think Faust, you know, it may even begun with like Warner Brothers cartoons or Bugs Bunny signing his life away, but then selling his soul. But you know, there was some cartoon that I think picked up on that motif. But then I read Marlowe's Faust as a freshman maybe in high school, but I remember it as a freshman in college, along with some Shakespeare plays and a lot of modern plays and Camus. And it was a really amazing lecture course from a pretty famous Shakespeare teacher whose obituary was written by Patrick Stewart, actually. But he was at UC Santa Barbara. So I read it there. I saw the Marlowe Faust. There was a really good Christian theater. It's still there, Lamb's Players in San Diego, and they did an amazing production of Faust. And they really pulled out the theatricality of the stage effects, which even is mentioned in the argument. You know, we're not going to be stingy about the budgets, you know, the producer. And so that's an interesting thing to talk about. But Goethe's Faust I read in college. I had a great teacher of modern plays who set them in amazing historical contexts. And we read Ibsen, but we read Lessing, we read Schiller, and we read Goethe. Goethe maybe less than the others, but then I read Faust on my own, or at least the first part, and wrote a paper for another class on comparing Faust with Spring's Awakening. I think Faust's influence on theater and other playwrights, it was one thing with Lessing and Schiller, but when Faust came in, I think stylistically, it kind of blew the doors off. And I think you get a lot of playwrights in the 19th century, really experimental playwrights that come out of that. And I think it goes all the way to Brecht in a way, and even contemporary. I don't even know. I mean, there are other people who may even be able to talk about that a little more lucidly. But the thing that strikes me is the variations on Faust. He wrote the first part and the second part, and in between those, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And there's a book by a man named Roger Shattuck called Forbidden Knowledge, which is what this is in a way all about, where he actually says Mary Shelley undermines male authority in Frankenstein more than any of these sort of heroic playwrights. And Goethe certainly is undermining a lot of things, I think, with Faust, and sort of turning Marlowe's Faust upside down. The only thing I'll mention, there are a lot of resources, is a Czechoslovakian animator who did things on Alice in Wonderland and I'll put the link in the thing. And I noticed it's on YouTube. He was an amazing animator in Czechoslovakia who for a long time felt he couldn't do art. He had to do propaganda against the Soviets. And he did a movie of Faust after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he considered that his first serious move back into doing art rather than propaganda. And most people would say his propaganda is highly artistic, extraordinary work. But so I stumbled on that. So I can't say I've mastered this work at all. I mean, and I spent a life finally figuring out King Lear, but this play is so big, I have not mastered it, but I keep exploring these weird manifestations of it. And Svankmajer mostly is based on Marlowe, but he might pull in some things from Goethe. So I'll just leave it there. It's a sort of a scatter shot, but he's incredibly theatrical. The arguments between the producer, the poet, and the clown, really the actor, I think those differences go back to the Greeks. You know, the producer who has to make the money and is building the sets, and sometimes that was the playwright in the Greek theater. But that argument of like, we want to make them laugh. No, we want to make money. No, we want to change the world. You know, that is, Goethe captures that rings so true to everyone who's worked in theater, and the kind of pretense of we're going to change the world, but really they're just trying to sell tickets and make people laugh. You know, I mean, what are we really doing in theater? And Goethe gets right to the heart of that, right at the top. And so I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. I mean, the thing that really fascinates me about Goethe is there are just a handful of people who have the kind of range of knowledge, understanding that he has. The only person that comes to my mind is Leonardo. And when you look at Leonardo's paintings, you can see the depth of his work on the human mind, of how eyes work, how societies work, what religion is, all of it condensed into this artwork. And I think Faust is that for Goethe. So, you know, we do these comprehensivist Wednesdays along with Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. In terms of comprehensivists, there isn't a better person in terms of person of this caliber with the artistic ability to present it. So I'm very, very excited about this. Thank you, Doug. Next up is Maritza.
So I think I'm fairly new. I would consider myself to be fairly new to Faust. I'm going to be reading it here for the first time with several of you. The very first thing that struck me about Faust, first of all, I have to thank Phil for recommending the book with the German original on the one side. I was unaware that this is not a novel. This is a poem. It rhymes. The entire German book rhymes. He wrote an entire book that is in rhyming couplets. I'm blown away. I don't have to know anything else about this author to know that I'm eternally impressed. So I can read the German. I'm much slower in reading the German than I am in reading the English, but I'm thoroughly just like so impressed. It rhymes. It's fascinating. And it gives, I get a little bit more depth in being able to read both the German and the English. So that was my first thing, was I didn't know it was actually poetry, which is really cool. The other thing is in the prelude in the theater, I saw, there's the three characters. You have the poet, the comedian, and the director. I see the poet he's our idealist, right? And for those of us who have been, we exploring, comprehensivity and syntopic learning together, we tend to be in agreement that an ideal That's why we get up in the morning, right? We're striving, we're seeking that meaningful path, and we're seeking the ideal. Naturally, that's the poet here, which I think is great. But I love that the comedian is the realist here. Of these three, the comedian is the realist. And this is, again, I'm not an expert, but these are my impressions, is that the poet is the idealist, the comedian is the realist, and then the director is kind of like the all-seer. So if I had to put him somewhere, I'd almost make him the godlike figure. Or the puppeteer, right? He's telling. So I'm amused that what I'm seeing here is that you have this overseer who's dictating to the realists and idealists how it is that they should ensure that these events unfold. And because I'm familiar, there's a lot of Spanish culture, music, opera that is set to this story. So while I've never read Faust, this tale of the man who's making the deals with the devil, it's something that you actually see quite a bit in Spanish culture. And it gets traced back to Faust. So I've heard of him often. So I'm really amused at the way that this book or this poem starts is with this kind of interplay. So those are, just my first impressions there were exactly that. And then one more thing I want to point out here is the comedian. So, I've identified him as the realist, right? He has this thing after a little bit of chatter between the poet, the director, and the comedian. Then the comedian talks about how we're going to do all these things to present a drama of this type. And he talks about how, you have to have rapture is going to grow. It's going to follow with grief and pain. And, he says, one meets by accident, emotes and lingers. And by one is entangled, one's bliss increases. Then one is in trouble, one's rapture grows, then follow grief and pain. Before you know, your story is completed. We must present the drama of this type. And then he says, reach for the fullness of a human life. And this is the realist, which to me, that sounds very kind of ideal, but he's saying, and then why that made concretized in my mind, him as the realist is, he says, we live it all, but few live it knowingly. If you but touch it, it will fascinate. And I think that that's a really strong and powerful thing to think of. And I just love the idea that it was placed in the hands of the realist, because you don't have to be ignorant of the ideal if you sit in that seat. And I thought that was great. And so, it's a very few short pages, but I have to say it's quite the phenomenal introduction to what will come. There's one more little phrase. This one comes from, the manager, and he says, what good is it to speak of inspiration? And then he says, to him who hesitates, it never comes. So I like that. Again, it's this, remember, if we're putting him in the role I've given him, right? He's the overseer. So the overseer is telling me not to stay sitting here dreaming or waiting for a muse. Act already. Just kind of cool. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Brian Nelson, you have read Faust in German. What do you think of Goethe and Faust? Please take your time. You can go up to 5 to 10 minutes. You're welcome to.
Okay, I did make a few notes. I really liked Doug's comments. First of all, the introduction I thought was brilliant. This is from Philip. This is a very difficult topic. I've read, as I said, different biographies, and I've heard descriptions of his life over time. In preparation for this meeting, I just looked up Goethe on Wikipedia, and I'll tell you, except for the bare facts of the chronology of his life, there are many, many different understandings and interpretations, and emphasis is placed on different things by different people. So that's really interesting. And I thought Philip did a great job in exercising his judgment in what he picked out. I I did not read this introduction. I just somehow overlooked that. But it is, as regards the tension between producer, poet, and actor, I think Faust is starting out with that, because I think he's flagging that in part that he's not just trying to write a play that can be produced. He has other, I guess he's addressing other issues. He has other goals. He has other approaches, and he's not limiting himself to the constraints of production. And I think that's especially true on part two. I'm very glad we're going to be doing part two. I like that a lot. Couple other things about the German. It does rhyme nicely, but I'll tell you that a lot of the poetic rhythms came out of Latin languages and Latin experience, Roman and Greek Latin. The pronunciation of those words is different from German in two ways. Number one, the vowel, most of these Latin languages, they end a lot with A. The vowel is most important. And a lot of the words end on vowels. In German, most of the words, the consonants are most important. The words end on consonants. And so there's a little bit of, in the German, there's a bit of contriving, as it with all, I would say with all German poets, to kind of make this work. And so you need to be a little bit flexible on the German. You'll see words being shortened, letters being left out to get the right number of rhythms, beats in the line. And then the Germans use a lot of compound words, so the words tend to be longer. And to avoid that, these German poets tend to be more recherché, if I could say that. They're selecting words out that are not at all current. So that's another in the German that I know. So that's a big difference between German prose and German poetry that I've seen consistently in different works I've read. Another point, that playing off of what Philip said, this I think makes it hard for anyone to read. At least it was hard for me, and I can imagine it's hard for others. It is this elitist education that Goethe had, very erudite, all these languages, steeped in ancient history, mythology. He uses a lot of allusions to that classical education in his work. And unless you understand the allusion, you're not going to understand the line, the verse, the work. And so it's a bit of a struggle I think for anyone, because we don't have that classical education the way he did. So as you read through this, I think you're going to find there's allusions to Greek gods and events in Greek mythology. You may not know at all what the heck is being talked about. And as to the scope of this man, again, I've read at least two biographies on him, and they're just, it's amazing how different they are from the Wikipedia description I just read today. But just to give you an idea, these are things that I think are fairly well established. He thought his most important intellectual work was his treatise on optics, which some people refer to as color. And I've read about what his theories are. It's whether the light and color are embedded in the object, or whether the light is in the air, or whether light is an energy. I don't remember exactly how it's spelled out, but it's not. It's as if objects had an iridescence, was the essence of light. And so I thought that was, very interesting. Whether that's the current view or not, I thought that was a very interesting insight. He himself thought that his most important practical achievement was being the minister of mining for this small duchy, I think it was, in the middle of Germany. And then finally, some people think his best works, especially the women I've talked to in Germany, think his love poetry is his best work. And that's not even mentioned in the bibliography I looked at today on Wikipedia. In fact, there's a 400-page collection of his love poems in German, and it's not even mentioned as one of his accomplishments in the Wikipedia bibliography. So that just shows how vast his writing is and the scope of his interests. I guess as the last thing I'd say is just kind of he was a man of his time. He lived in aristocratic circles as an aristocrat. I think he enjoyed that. He did have tremendous impact on intellectual life. It was a tremendous occasion, the university in Jena, where he had an influence. But if anybody's interested more, I'd recommend that you read a biography and see that in some ways it's no longer the life we're living.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Brian, could you put the biography that you would recommend in the chat? Just the name of the biography, and so people can follow up on reading up at their convenience. Thank you, Brian.
It's in the other room, so.
What's it?
It's in German and it's in the other room.
Oh, it's in the German. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it, and delighted to have you here. And look forward to your comments every time. Next up is going to be Allison. Allison has not really read Faust, but she is into literature. She always has interesting things to say about literature. So, Allison.
Okay, so I was driving back from the city. There's a storm going on, and I'm trying to listen to this in the car. And I literally had to stop it a few times to replay. And, I'm dealing with like the traffic and the rain and everything. So this is not like how I would normally approach literature. I really thought I had a good afternoon to do this, but what I was struck by just listening to it, there was a certain point where I went, is this an iambic pentameter? Because it sort of sounds like it a bit. They definitely reminded me of Shakespeare in some ways, with sort of the flowing and the meter of the sound of it. Some things about it seemed quite funny. And so it reminded me a little bit of Midsummer Night's Dream. And then, just now I've been kind of going through it, and I really like the language in it a lot. It just seems very, like he has wonderful images. It seems like he's using the words to paint images, like page 9, where it says, what sprang from our deepest feelings, what our lips tried timidly to form, failing now and now perhaps succeeding, is devoured by a single brutish moment. It's really just wonderful language. So I really am looking forward to reading this and learning more about it. And I was thinking, as I was kind of reading a few descriptions about it before this week, this idea of the Faustian bargain, it did kind of make me think a little bit of Dante. And, this whole idea of that as we go through life, we're always making bargains with things. Do I want this? Do I do this? And then want that? And if I do this, will I get this? And it is kind of an interesting idea. And I always think it's interesting how different writers throughout time sort of toy with the same ideas. And it sort of comes back to philosophy in a way, that a lot of the same ideas are tackled over and over again by different, writers, poets, choreographers, because the same themes, and it happens because we all go through the same experiences. At the end of the day, we go through the same experiences over and over and over again. So different writers will approach them in various ways. And sometimes it seems like I'm not quite sure we learn from these experiences. Human beings tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. But anyway, I really look forward to learning more about it and reading this.
Thank you, Allison. Now, Mariana mentioned that she studied it way back when she was studying, German Romantics. Mariana, would you like to make any comments? You will need to unmute, Mariana.
I'm just beginning to unscramble all the synapses, trying to get back to that, that period of time. So if it's all right, I'll sit and listen for the
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Mariana. Folks, if you would like to talk about what interests you about going on this journey with Faust with us, you're welcome to type ! At this point. Just your interest in Faust. If you have anything to say about why do you want to study? Why do you want to go on this journey with us? If you want to say anything, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we're going to go to Phil again. I'm going to give about 15 seconds if anybody wants to say anything. Okay, Doug has something to add. Doug, go ahead.
It's something I wanted to mention at the beginning, and that's Kepler. There's an interesting book called Kepler's Witch, and it's about his mother, and he had to go and save her from a witch trial at some point in his life. And he actually went to Wittenberg, and I remember hearing something that he actually played the ingenue role in a production of Faust. I don't know if it was Marlowe or one of the medieval scripts of it. I can't remember. Can't even find the reference to it. I read a lot about Kepler because Kepler is considered by some serious people to be the last person who saw theology and mathematics as the same discipline. And he discovered the movement of the planets and how the planets move in elliptical orbits. And he's an interesting figure to throw in this because he's a scientist who became actually excommunicated from the Lutheran Church for disagreeing on 2 or 3 points of 32 points about the communion, and so he was ostracized and not allowed to take communion. He's and he never left. The Jesuits were trying to recruit him into the Catholic Church, but he never left. So Kepler is a very interesting figure to throw in the middle of this. And if it's true that he played the ingenue in some production of Faustus at Wittenberg, which is where Hamlet went to school, it's a sort of an interesting oddball connection.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
So my interest is getting an overview of the text. As I said, I've read parts of it over the years, and it's really been a fascinating work. I've been pointed in the right direction by different people. We studied smaller parts, and it was always good. So I'm interested in the overview here. Which again, I think Philip set up beautifully, covered not only Faust's life, but all this tremendous intellectual and literary history through Spangler. Very well done. And the other thing is, it's really what Maritza had evidenced in her comments. There's really brilliant insights and wording in this text. Yes, they're embedded in a story, but sometimes they're just amazing, amazing insights that come out in a single line or couplet. And I'm interested in kind of getting in touch with all those again. It's been a few years. So now bringing those two things together in, I don't know, 10 sessions, parts 1 and 2, the overview and the close study of the text, that's going to be, it's going to be a challenge. So I'm interested in seeing how you guys handle that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Brian, I have news for you. You're going to help in doing that because, the fact that you know German and fact that you have this deep experience with it, I think that's going to be invaluable, and then Doug is going to be there. And so, I think we're going, it's going to be an adventure. So thank you. All right. I'm going to hand it over to, first, it's going to be Rich. Rich, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. My name is Brenda. Rich is my son. He switched my account. I don't know how to switch it back. But
okay.
anyways, what I wanted to say is that this whole notion of what we call, or what has been called, selling your soul to the devil, you know, has been with us in many ways. Literature brings it alive with stories of Faust. There's also a very good novel called The Monk that was written in 1799 by Matthew Lewis about a very holy priest or spiritual man who succumbs to evil, and the devil shows up at the end and had been involved all along. So very interesting. I really wanted to bring up a quote from Epicurus, which I think is really pertinent. And here it is. No one chooses a thing seeing that it is evil, but being lured by it when it appears good in comparison to a greater evil, he is caught. I think that goes a long way to explain how people succumb to, you know, that dark side that is within all of us, you know, where the potential for that is within all of us. But I think that's a great quote, and it goes a long way to begin to explain how, you know, people can succumb to that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. I'm going to hand it over back to Phil. Phil.
Okay. So what I want to do in the next few moments is try to tie the dedication and the intro to the rest of the book. And I know a lot of you mentioned that you tend to, maybe in the past readings, you tend to have skipped over it. And so did I. I'll be honest with you, when I first read Faust, I kind of skipped over it. I'm like, okay, whatever. I want to get to the actual story. But having reread it several times, I now see that there are a lot of interesting things to touch upon there. Just before I do that, though, I do want to mention a couple of things that came out in the discussion so far. So thank you, Brian, by the way, for your feedback. And I wanted to say, I kind of skipped over about the meaning of the Apollinian and the Magian culture versus the Faustian. I want to just quickly give a quick synopsis of what that means. So the Apollinian is the classical and the culture of classical antiquity. And if you remember, it's all about order, it's all about symmetry, it's all about balance. If you remember Aristotle, the golden mean, right? All of these things, that's the heart and center of that culture. And it, of course, expresses itself in its architecture. Very balanced, very focused on order, very, I guess, enclosed in some ways. You know, think of Parthenon or just in general Greek sculpture. And then you have the Magian, which again, it's Spangler, of course, he talks about the synthesis of Near Eastern religions. So he combines Judaism, mysticism, Gnosticism, early Christianity into this one culture. And it is also very much a culture that is focused on limitations. You know, the big story in the Bible is, of course, the transgression of Adam and Eve. They had some limits and they transgressed them. Compare that now to the Faustian world, in which, again, Spangler claims this is the current dispensation that we find ourselves in. The motto of that world is no limitation and no limits, right? So we gain something and we'll lose something. Now, it's ironic to me in some ways that the story of Faust, the payment for this infinity and this unlimited quest for whatever is his soul. Now, soul is a kind of it's a hard thing to pin down. But in my mind, it always seems to me that the issues that we're dealing with today they're bound up with meaning, and soul and meaning are kind of together. So in some ways, I feel like our culture, we've gained a lot of comfort and a lot of power over nature, but we seem to have lost a lot of our ability to derive meaning from our lives. I think that's a malaise that is plaguing the Western civilization today. And whether or not we recover from that is, it's an open question, I think, but it's a fascinating question, right? And that is why I think Faust is so interesting and so important for us to go through, and because we can ask these questions ourselves, and we become part of that conversation that has been going on for thousands, if not, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, whether or not it's worth it, and whether or not it's a good bargain to gain unfettered access to the universe, if you will, unfettered access to knowledge, if you will, and exchange it for this vacuum of meaning, perhaps, or soul. We've lost our soul, maybe we can say it like that. So that's, I just want to mention that, since that seems to have struck a chord. It has struck a chord with me, I have to say, because as I look at it again, why am I rereading Faust? Well, because I live in Faustian age. We all are. We are all living it, and we can ask ourselves the question, was it worth it? Okay, now getting back to our text in hand, I want to read just the first stanza of the dedication. I have the translation by Walter Arndt. It's a Norton Critical Edition. I recommend that. It's a good translation because it preserves the rhyme and the rhythm, and I want to read that, and then we can talk a little bit about that. Dedication. Once more you near me, wavering apparitions that early showed before the turbid gaze. Will now I seek to grant you definition? My heart essay again the former days. You press me. Well, I yield to your petition. As all around you rise from mist and haze, what wafts you with magic glamour is quickening my breast to youthful tremor. What's interesting about this, besides just the meaning of it, is the form. It is written in a form called ottava rima, which is a stanza of 8 lines rhymed in a A-B, C-C fashion. And all of the dedication is rhymed in the same way. When we move on to the next section, the intro, it switches. The rhyme is different. It is no longer that. And then it keeps switching throughout the book. And so one of the things to keep in mind is Goethe is, in some ways, because he's being a comprehensivist, and because he's a polymath, and because he has amazing command of the language, he, in some ways, showcases all of the different meters, all the different possibilities of composing this. So it's all rhymed, but it is rhymed in different styles. And this ottava rim, of course, harkens back to the Italian Renaissance. Boccaccio used ottava rima. So this, again, ties us back to our relationship with the classical antiquity. And it's interesting that Goethe chooses this particular style and rhyme to open the whole thing up. So in some ways, it harkens back. It ties us back to everything that has gone before. But not now moving to the actual content. In some ways, and I've missed this when I first read this, but obviously this is an invocation. It's a very similar invocation that precedes a lot of the classical texts, where the author is essentially asking the supernatural. He turns to some idealistic, transcendent being, whether it's muses, like the classical Greek, or whether it's Holy Spirit, like Dante, or whether it's inspiration. And in this case, it is something else. It's not even any of these three. It's wavering apparitions in German. And I'll every now and then I'll sprinkle some of these German words because I think they just sound great. It's schwankende Gestalten, schwankende Gestalten, wavering apparitions. Now the word Gestalten should sound familiar because we have the word in English Gestalt, which is the word that is certainly overloaded with meaning. It's the word that can be translated as form or as becoming. There are definitely a lot of meanings there, but in this case, it's something that is not material, right? It's a form that is almost like a recollection in his mind, and it is there to awaken him to this poetic process. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this in the earlier section, in the earlier yeah, in the earlier section of what I was talking about, Dante wrote Faust over 60 years. He started writing in 1770s. He left off for other enterprises that he had, and then he resumed writing, and he finished Faust basically on his deathbed. The part 2 was actually published posthumously after he died. So this is one of the longest masterpieces in terms of the time it took to conceive it and to write it. The original part was called Faust, and it contained just part 1. The part that most of us are familiar with that has to do with the love, I guess the tragedy of Gretchen. But the complete play took actually almost 60 years to complete. So in this case, the dedication was written towards the end of this process. And so a lot of the people that were there that Dante knew when he started were no longer alive. And so the second stanza talks about how some of the echoes of this youthful memories that he has, they're no longer with him. And so he wants to dedicate the work to the people that were there surrounding his initial foray into literature. So this is quite a somber section. And then we go into the prelude in the theater, and the mood and the meter change dramatically. And from a somber mood, we're now in this completely different setting, a setting that is very pragmatic, a setting that's very physical, right? Here we were with the apparitions and kind of this ethereal world and the world of inspiration, not material at all. And here, we have the director who's talking about how the stage is being already put together and constructed. And now we have these 3 characters. And it was interesting for me to hear Maritza talk about the director being God. I thought that was interesting because I was asking myself this question: which one do you think Goethe identifies most with? Is he the poet? Is he the director? Is he the comic, the guy who kind of brings the director and the idealistic poet and the pragmatic director together? So that's an open question for the group. I'm curious what you guys think. I thought it was wonderful to read about the synthesis. And I think to me, Goethe is all about synthesis of different themes. And that's wonderful to experience because a lot of times you just get philosophy and it's a little dry, or you get poetry and it's a little, it's wonderful to the form of it is great, but it lacks the depth. But here we have a work of art that brings together both philosophy and art and poetry and meaning in this wonderful blend. And what this intro does to me is the kind of, it's a challenge to do the same. Challenge to not discount the place where we are, the place where the crowd lives. And this word, the crowd, is actually very prominent in this prelude. It's the word Menge in German, but then there are other words like das Publik, the public, right? The audience. And there are other words that are mentioned. And it's all about understanding where people are and the experience of people that is not just idealistic, not just off in the mountains, not just off in some monastery cell praying or experiencing some enlightenment, but it's actually where people are, where they want to understand life in its fullness. And in some ways, that's what Faust wants, right? He wants to experience life in its fullness, and he's somewhat sick, as we'll see, of just having this intellectual experience of studying. And he's studying law, and probably Goethe was maybe hearkening back to his years at Leipzig University when he was memorizing it to memorize the laws of different statutes and so forth. Very, very boring and unsatisfying to him. And so what this intro does, it points us back to a synthesis of life as it is, with people as they are. They storm, they've just read a journal, as Goethe says, and now they're breaking their necks to get into this, to see something new. And maybe afterwards, they're gonna go to a roulette or to a brothel. And what are we trying to achieve here? And this is such a great way to bridge important philosophical topics in the context of everyday life, because a lot of times they're separated, and they lack a bridge, and Goethe brings this bridge together, and the bridge itself is art. It's art. Art brings together to him truth, philosophy, and also real life in its fullness and its multi-dimensionality. So that is just something I wanted to mention very quickly on the intro. Let me see if I have any other notes here on this. Yeah, I think this is probably all I want to say at this point.
All right.
Cont, I will turn it back to you, and maybe we can open it up to others.
Thank you. So I want to now open it up for any comments, any questions. Please go ahead and type exclamation mark. We want this to be very interactive. Feel free to ask any question, make any comments. I think your observation about the fact that we are living in a Faustian world by Spangler's definition, it's absolutely true. We have done amazingly well in terms of our knowledge of the outside world, and especially our ability to transform the outside world. It's just incredible, when you compare it to anything before the 19th century. This is really the Industrial Revolution, and everything that we have done just transformed life. And it has given us many, many things, including long lives. Most of us would be dead by now if it had not been for that. It's been tremendous. But it is at the price of lack of focus on the spirit. Carl Jung, in his book, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, is saying exactly the same thing in his own way. So it was really, really good observation. All right, folks, so go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to ask questions or have any comments. Let's start with Brian. Brian, go ahead.
So I will say I'm already getting what I hoped out of these sessions, because I'm not that versed in literature or the arts. I tend to read philosophy, and this insights like for Goethe, the art brings together philosophy and life. That's really something for me to think about, both in general and as I read this work. So I think this is going to be a great adventure for me.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, that's a very large point, and very few people can do it as well as Goethe can do it, because he is a deep thinker. He's a deep philosopher, and he's a deep artist, and he is a practical man. So bringing together art, philosophy, and life is what he does all the time. And to have an artist of this caliber bring that together for you is really, really special. All right. Anybody else? Any thoughts? We deliberately want to start it slow to see what questions are. So firstly, just about, so there are three things that Phil has put on the table, implicitly or explicitly. One is, which of these three characters is Faust? Where is Faust in those three characters? That's one question. Second, do you agree? What are your thoughts about the Western civilization as having made a Faustian bargain, that we are living in a Faustian age? And third, what do you think about this proposition of Goethe that art brings together philosophy and life? So any comments on any of these three? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. You can comment about any one of them or all three of them, or you can bring up anything else that you would like.
while people are thinking, I can maybe say a few words just to, so we're not silent here. There's also a discussion about the value of intellectual pursuits versus experience. And this is evidenced by the poet's desire, nostalgic desire to re-experience his youth. As the conversation keeps going back and forth between the comic and the poet, they keep striving for some balance between idealism and the beauty of love and the practical desire to actually put together something that people will come to watch and be interested in. And the poet says, well, I wish I could go back to, you want me to write a love story. Okay, fine. I wish I could go back to my, the time of my youth when I could experience it again. And the comic says, well, you don't want to actually, because the thing that you have that you didn't have then is the experience and the maturity and the wisdom and ability to express yourself that you couldn't do it the way you couldn't do it earlier in life. So the question is left open. It's an open-ended question, whether or not he's right. And this ability to go back, and again, we're talking about limits, right? The limitations, the natural limitations that that age puts on us. Is this a good thing? Is this something that we wish we didn't have? Or is it in fact, an advantage to experience aging, and with it, wisdom, and with it, ability to communicate to others? Or should we have this experience of eternal youth that never ages? We always experience the freshness of love. We always, but at a price again. So it's right from the beginning, you can see the tension being set up for these topics, right? And Faust, of course, will pick the youth, and he wants to experience life to its fullest. And we're going to see what happens with that. And but right here, you already have the seeds of that conflict, the seeds of that question, this desire to be unlimited, the desire to transcend age, transcend the natural order of things. And that's where I think there's a connection between this intro and the rest of the book. So I just wanted to bring that up to maybe, again, seed the discussion a little bit and see what thoughts you have about this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Brian. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark to provide whatever comments or questions that you have. Allison.
I think what's funny about this idea of going back to your youth, I really wouldn't do it. I wouldn't, because I feel like the thing is, yes, you just feel everything more intensely when you're younger. So the joys are higher, the lows are much, much, much lower. And I think the problem with when you're young is that you don't have any frame of reference. So whatever you feel like this is the end of the world, it's so intense. And I feel like the great thing about getting older is that you see that life is has ups and downs and ups and downs. So when you're in one of those down periods, you just have to wait and you're going to come out of it on your own. And when you're younger and you first go into one of those down things, you don't know that. And I think that's why the majority of suicides are, when people are very young, they're 18. And I think because they don't have any frame of reference to know that that's just a difficult time that they'll come out of. So I don't know, a few more wrinkles are worth it, I think, personally. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was about the idea of art incorporating philosophy. And I really think that's true. And I think that the reason that art is so good at it is because not everything can be conveyed in words. So, literature can talk about philosophy. And I love philosophy, but it's true. It's what you're saying, Philip. Sometimes it's dry. And sometimes, literature can talk about philosophical ideas, but it's in the way of a story that pulls you into the story. So you're still having the same ideas. I always feel that's why I like historic fiction for the same reason, because sometimes history can be really dry, but a historical fiction novel pulls you into the story and you're learning all the same things, but in a much more engaging way. But I also feel like with art and music and dance, they each have their own way of showing things. So, you know, like words don't convey everything, and music doesn't convey everything, and art doesn't, and dance doesn't, but each convey their own sort of thing. And so you kind of experience the philosophy in different ways from each one of those mediums. And when you have all of the arts, then you get a truer representation of philosophy, I think. But I think it's really important. I think sometimes, maybe especially because we have computers, we're a very word-centered culture, but the visual and the musical components are so important. And so I you know, that's why I just think no matter what arts, it's so crucial, you know. And I think it's just interesting, like when I remember these early scenes in Ukraine, and they're in the middle of the, you know, the war had just started, but musicians would go out into the square and play, and people would come out of their houses to watch. And it really just struck me just how powerful and important art is, that people were risking their lives at that point, and that they needed art so much at such a difficult time. So, you know, I don't know if we could ever completely understand the power of art, but it's also interesting how every culture in the world does it. And all these cultures, these countries that before they had any way of meeting one another, they all needed art. And sometimes it was different ways. Like some countries, you can't represent a figure, but you have the lines that are, you know, very emotional and evocative. You know, and each country does it in their own way, but yet the arts were a part of every culture. So it's something so primal in us to need the arts. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Alison. And especially high art, like what Goethe does, what Dante does, that is philosophy. That is the most accessible means you have of thinking about philosophy. That's exactly what what Bible does. That's exactly what Mahabharata does. It is a way of, you know, Zhuangzi does that for Taoism, stories which capture the deepest of philosophical principles in a way which are accessible to you, so you can see what it means to you in your life, and they have the full emotional charge. So it brings together all your faculties. It brings together your reason. It appeals to your reason. It appeals to your emotions, and it motivates you for action. And that is art at its best. And that's what this, you know, Faust is. So thank you. Thank you so much. Next up is going to be Myron, followed by Brian. Myron.
Hi. My thoughts are still very unformed, but I want to try. So I think first going back to, so first of all, I would love to add on to the discussion of the tension between the value of youth and the value of age in the setup to this magnificent play. I think going back to Philip's question from a little before about which of these three characters Goethe would likely most identify with, I think it is very much agreeable so far for me, at least, that Goethe would certainly sympathize with whoever has that, what's the word? Strum und Drang spirit, that spirit of youthful, maybe feistiness, maybe youthful revolt. But I think, so I don't know what version you guys are reading. I'm reading the Martin Greenberg version. I think it was your second link. And I think around my lines, 187 to 190, where it really captures, maybe more so than the specific character, I think these lines really capture Goethe's like cherishing of the youthful spirit, right? Cherishing still their bright dreams and illusions. You'll never please those whose race is run. For them, there are no more surprises, but the youth for whom all's just begun. They will shower you with praises. And what's funny is we were just talking about how the poet was like, okay, well, I wish I could have my youth back. And then the clown is saying, well, maybe not. Maybe you should see the value in the age that you've gotten. Maybe you should, know how to sweep the old familiar harp strings with boldly yet with fine grace too, to make by pleasing indirections for the end your drama has in view. But what's funny is that the manager literally says, okay, we've talked enough. Stop talking about the value of age. I want you to be young. I want you to embody the youthful spirit for me right here, right now. Forget about age. I want you to feel free to try whatever we please. I want you to not save any money on paint and properties. I want you to hang out heaven's big and little lamps. I want you to go all the way around creation's great circle, from heaven down to hell and hopefully back. So yeah, I think what I was trying to say with that is, he really is, I found this part to be quite touching. I don't know where it's going to lead, but I found it touching how the manager was essentially saying, assuming his words are benign, your race isn't run yet. There are many surprises ahead of you. Your youth is still going on. Maybe it has just begun in a sense, when you become conscious of the power that you can tap into from your youth for your literary work. And most importantly, I see many showers of praise ahead of you if you just go out there and if you just start writing and trying to please the audience.
Wonderful. Great comments, Myron. Really, really appreciate that. Great comments. Thank you. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Doug. Brian.
So, wow, I really appreciate Philip's framing of all this, and everybody's comments on the text. Unfortunately, I didn't do the text this week, so I'm behind. I can't really comment from that perspective, but from the biographical perspective, I said earlier that Goethe lived in different times. What I had in particularly in mind was he was kind of a womanizer, and he chased after women, especially, it seemed, reading the biographies, it seemed that he chased after aristocratic women whose husbands were out of town. And it didn't seem to be a big problem in the neighborhood. So that's a little different. But and that's where all these love poems come from. He wrote 400 pages of love poems to married women. He himself didn't get married until after, I think he went to Italy twice. After his second Italian, or during his second Italian, he met a young Italian woman. He married her, had one son, but then I think, as I recall, she died when he was 70. And then he wanted to go and get another wife. And he had his mind on an 18-year-old. And this, his friend talked him out of that. So two things out of that. I mean, you can see the biographical element in this text, how it plays out. To me, that's very, very interesting. Plus, I'll just put a footnote. Instead of chasing after and marrying this woman, his friend said he'd just make a fool of himself in the community if he did that, that Goethe would make a fool of himself. So instead, Goethe spent his time writing his autobiography, Poetry and Truth. So we're probably better off that it didn't chase up that last woman.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Jan, followed by Doug. Jan. Jan, go ahead. We can't hear you. There is some problem with your audio. So once you fix it, just go ahead and type exclamation mark again. Next up is going to be Doug, followed by Maritza.
Well, I wanted to pick up on this first scene between the producer or director, poet, and clown. I think Goethe actually identifies with all three. I think he probably did all three. I think he probably felt all three of those things. And I think Maritza's right that the clown is in a way the most realist, because clown is the warrior in the battlefield of the theater, but immediate contact to the audience, and whether they like it or hate it or crying or weeping. And I think a lot of this has to do with the Italian comedians that were very important. Some friends of my parents gave me this. It's from Italy. And so that figure, the fool, which is different from the clown, the fool is more innocent than the clown. This is more like a fool. But some of the clowns are like the white clown, who's very into power, and there are essays about Mussolini being a variation of the white clown, and Fellini sort of working on those archetypes between the fool and the white clown, and Fellini did a movie on clowns. So, but I think here's the thing: the producer in this text, until the end, when they all kind of switch positions, which theater people do all the time, but it's the producer is counting the dough. The poet wants to pull the heartstrings and redefine history. And the clown just wants to grab the laughs, but he's also the guy telling other people his advice is in some ways the most solid. But the producer is obsessed about youth. And he's kind of like a Marvel movie producer. I don't care about the budget. We'll spend $200 million on CGI and $400 million, and we'll break records, and we'll spend the last 40 minutes having young people doing constant battle for 45 minutes and blowing stuff up, and write me a play that does that. And so it's like putting spectacle instead of action at the most important. Aristotle said spectacle is the lowest value in the theater, and that action and character and thought and words and music are all more important than spectacle. So the producer in some ways is saying that. So, and I was at a theater conference once, two theater conferences, one in New York, one in Chicago, and they were trying to deal with the artistic and home and how to create a home for the artist. And you create the vision and we'll raise the money. This was people on boards. 2 years later, after the book, The Artistic Home, was written, I was at a conference in Chicago, and they all started talking about money again and marketing and how to sell. And I got so depressed, I actually hyperventilated. I had to leave the conference in Chicago and walk down the hill. And suddenly I found myself in front of the Chicago Art Institute, the Art Institute of Chicago. And I walked in, and as soon as I saw those paintings, it's like I could breathe again. I was actually suffocating. And I've defined that every board of directors wants Goethe to run their theater, or P.T. Barnum, but in the end, they really want P.T. Barnum. They just want to, the guy who's going to make it work and sell seats and get people in the doors. So there's this huge pretense in American theater often that we're changing the world, but in essence, I've seen theaters across the country hire cutting edge artists, and a year and a half later they fire them because, wow, that's not what we really wanted, But at one point they did want cutting edge art, but it's an ongoing battle. But the actor's right at the middle of it. In fact, the guy who defined Shakespearean production in the early 20th century to get rid of the big sets and focus on the actors. Granville Barker, I think was his name. He wrote prologues to Shakespeare, but it returned Shakespeare to the actors and take it away from the set designers. He wrote another book saying there's an ongoing battle between the actor and the playwright for the attention of the audience. And he's saying that goes back to the Greeks. Who's going to win, the actor or the playwright? Now we have a lot of people like producers and other people who are telling both the director and the playwright and the actor what to do. And so the battle for the audience has been distanced. And so I think Maritza's instincts are dead on. The clown knows what it's about, And so that's what I'd share.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Let's see if Jan's mic is fixed. Jan, go ahead. Nope. Still can't hear you. Okay, Maritza.
So I was kind of thinking over and over about Phil's question on, which one was Goethe. my first thought actually was that he naturally envisioned himself to be the poet, because if we point out what this prelude is, you have a producer who doesn't actually have a body of work. Like he's looking at the poet and the comedian talking about, build me something great. I already have the people. And that, first of all, I find it to be terribly amusing that the phrasing and the setup for so great a work of art actually is telling us that this was something that we're to believe it was produced on the fly when the audience was already seated. So I had thought that maybe Gautier was the poet, but I kept oscillating whether or not he was actually one or both. Or I was thinking maybe he's the comedian, because the comedian is the one that he looks at what the poet said and what the director said, and he goes, well, those are not contradictions. We can do both. So I was thinking, well, that has to be Gautier. But I think I ultimately settled on agreeing with Doug here that Gautier actually envisions himself as all of them. And that kind of makes more sense to me, because I really can envision either one of them. And I feel like perhaps what he is trying to say to us, kind of behind the scenes, is that all three of these types, and if we're going to, I'm giving them the archetypes, the realist, the idealist, and the overseer. All three of them were necessary in the production that you're about to engage upon. And so with that setup, it'll be interesting to see what comes next. And I wonder if it will be apparent to us as readers which hat he's putting on for the different scenes. I will be curious how that unfolds for us as we're reading.
Wonderful. Okay, let's try one more time, Jan.
Sorry about that, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Apologize. I don't have a point to make, but the discussion about the choice between the experience and intellectual pursuit being rooted in age kind of gave me a pause. I recently read a poem by David White, and it needs a little bit of, I put a link in the chat. I'm gonna read a couple paragraphs, but before I do, it needs a bit of unpacking. What he wrote about is an Irish fable about a priest who is standing on the edge of a forest in the field, and he hears the cry of a blackbird, and at the same time he hears the ring of a bell, and it is about being awakened to the life that is in the forest, and just hearing the cry of a blackbird versus going back to the church and dedicating his life to the pursuit of knowledge. I'm going to try to read it the way the first two paragraphs, the way David usually recites it, because he repeats the stanzas. The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird call from the corner of a field. The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird calling from the corner of a field, asking you to wake into this life, or inviting you deeper into the one that awaits. Either way takes courage. Either way wants you to be nothing but the self that is no self at all, wants you to walk to the place where you find you already know you have to give every last thing away.
Wow.
It is a very different view on a choice that you have to be aware of. And I wonder if we do have to make a choice.
Jan, can you do me a favor? Can you reread it one more time?
So this is just the first two.
Yeah, just that. If you could reread it. So I want to make sure that everybody got it. Go ahead.
The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird calling from a corner of the field. The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird calling from the corner of a field, asking you to wake into this life, or inviting you deeper into the one that awaits. Asking you to wake into this life, or inviting you deeper into the one that awaits. Either way takes courage. Either way wants you to be nothing but the self that is no self at all. Either way takes courage. Either way wants you to be nothing but that self that is no self at all. Wants you to walk to the place where you find you already know you have to give everything, every last thing away. It's longer, and there are a few other paragraphs there, but it just takes a slightly different view on this notion of intellectual pursuit versus experiencing life. That's all I got.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jan. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Phil.
Yeah, this is great, actually, that Jan brought up this poem, because I wanted to bring in William Blake into this equation, because I think it's very pertinent. William Blake, just like Goethe, in some ways wanted to bring together the blackbird and the bell. And in his poetry, there's a I don't remember by heart, but it's basically this idea that he's walking by a field and he sees the monks gathering up, tying up his joys and desires, or I forget exactly how it goes, but that famous line. And of course, his idea of art was to bring in the fullness of human experience, the religion, the emotion, the love into a single kind of a whole that made sense. And whether or not he did it is an open question. But I think Goethe also tried to do that. As Brian alluded to, Goethe lived a full life. He had very little limits put on himself. So he was definitely a Faustian character, we can say. And that story about him being attracted to a young girl in his in his 80s or whatever is a wonderful kind of expression of that. Definitely a man who prized life in all of its fullness, richness, and that's why, of course, he can write a masterpiece like this that, again, doesn't just leave us with some dry philosophical maxims, but actually tries to bring all of that and put it side by side with the reality of human existence. All of it in its ugliness, in its richness, in its angelic, in its demonic, in its and that's why it's such a work that has such enduring quality, because I think in our lives we've missed something. We are walking like men who have half of our being sawn off, and we're yearning for that, though. And so we see the deep calls unto deep, right? We need that in our lives. We need that fullness, that richness. And so a lot of times we turn to works of art because they reawaken us to that. So one point I want also to make, Maritza, I think after listening to you, I am starting to wonder if Goethe had that internal dialogue or conversation. It's not a dialogue, it's three of them. And a conversation in his mind as he was deciding how to write this, a dialogue between a poet sitting in his head, a director, and a clown, because I think he's all three. After listening to you, I'm starting to slowly gravitate to that view that perhaps he himself is all three, and he has different parts of him trying to be idealistic, and some part of him wants to be famous, and that means success and wide reception, and some part of him wants to be kind of the jester who brings both of these directions into one. So anyway, very interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. So I'd say two things. I have one thing to say and one question. So I also agree that Goethe is all three. Basically, he's a fantastic example of a human being who actually engages all the human faculties. So it is his all mind, his all emotion, his all action. His all three things are going full blast in him, and they're talking to each other continuously and having all kinds of conversations with each other, and he's guided by all of that. One question that I had is that you talked about Goethe finishing the second part of Faust on his deathbed. So there is this tremendous gap. Now, also add to the fact that Goethe kept going at full pace every day of his life. So Goethe, 60 years later, or even 10 years later, is a different man. He's very different. It also reminds me of Leonardo da Vinci, who carried his paintings of Mona Lisa and John the Baptist with him for decades and kept working on them. So, and here he doesn't have to work on them explicitly, but the mind is working on it. So how do you see, it's a very rare thing to see something which is done in youth and in old age. So what is the difference between, what difference is,
well, it's actually very telling. It's very telling because the first part is much more emotional, much more experiential, as we'll see, much more about gaiety and youth and having fun and the tragedy of all of that. The second part is much more intellectual, much more about ideals and meaning and much more sort of philosophical, I would say. And in some ways, it represents his growth and his seasons in life that he experienced. I would say the reason, as he was writing in the older age, he was definitely much more philosophical and detached from the gaiety of the youth, which, again, that part was completed around 1770s. It was actually called Urfaust, which was the first part, never got published, thankfully, because the two parts actually make a lot more sense together. But Urfaust was done, I guess he was in the prime of his youth. And then the second part, he was still working on his deathbed. And people say that he was as lucid in the last days of his life as he was ever in his whole life. So in fact, when he died, some people were even saying he doesn't look like an old man. He still looks strong. And so they were wondering if he himself made that Faustian bargain in some ways. And so, yeah.
No, and that's a very interesting comment, because when you look at people like Leonardo, I've studied Leonardo, I've not studied Goethe, but you have the same kind of feeling that they keep the youth, the entire energy, the focus, the emotion, and they keep growing until they die. Through the entire age, they keep that spirit of youth to the end. And year after year, their ability keeps growing. So what they can do in their later life is at a completely different level than what they started out with. All right, folks, any comments? So I'm very excited. So can you, Phil, can you give us a preview of what is coming up next time, 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, so we're gonna start on the prologue in heaven, which is gonna get us going, and then I believe we also have some scenes from Act 1. So I think we have it on the website as far as the reading.
That's fine. So the people can look it up. So it's going to be 9 more sessions, right?
Yep.
Okay. So folks, please do your reading. I think Doug put movie in the chat. I'm definitely going to watch it. Doug knows so much about art. So if he recommends a movie, I will watch it. So I recommend that as well. And so that's what I have. I want to tell you about a couple more things coming up, which are related. On Wednesday, Phil is going to be back, and he's doing a follow-up piece on Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield is very much connected to this because he has some very deep ideas about poetry and what poetry can do for you. So, Phil, can you give a little bit of preview of the meetup on Wednesday?
Yeah, so we talked last time about Barfield and the connection between language and consciousness. And this time around, we're going to do a review because it's been some time, but also dive into some new concepts, some more detailed views at metaphors in poetry and the different types of metaphors that Barfield, the way Barfield classifies them. So I think that's going to be interesting to look at. And then if we have time, we'll revisit the idea of saving the appearances, which is his conception of how the changes in consciousness resulted in changes of how we perceive the world in general. And there's some interesting thoughts there as well that we can talk about.
All right, I'm going to put a link in the chat. You know what, Maritza, can you do me a favor? Can you go ahead and put a link in the Wednesday's meetup in the chat for 52 Living Ideas? I just want to make sure that people have that. I was blown away by Owen Barfield. It is part of my just complete fascination for language right now. I'm just taking in so much on language. So Owen Barfield, I've been reading his book on poetic diction. He's a very deep thinker. And what he is saying, if I had to summarize his thought, what he's saying is that language has the power to produce felt change of consciousness. So that means that these words can make you see something that you've never seen before. And that's what all great art does. That you hear that and it takes you it gives you a new perspective that you have not seen. And you go, wow. So that's one. Second, I also want to tell you that today I have a meetup at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on a book called Clear and Simple as the Truth. It's the best style book that I have ever read. It is a style that was developed, it is called the classic style. It was a style that was developed during the 17th century France. It's not just style of writing, it is fundamentally more a style of speaking that gets transformed into writing. It's not really a style of speaking, it's actually a style of thinking. And it is very close. It's actually an implementation of a view of knowledge, view of language, view of thought, which is based on metaphors, that we start with our grasp of the physical world and we start to see patterns in them. And we base our concepts off that. And that's what gives it both the conceptual range as well as the emotional power. So that's what the book is about. And I'm going to do an introductory meetup. Thank you, Marisa, for putting both the links in the chat. So if you just want to find out what it is about, you're welcome to show up at 9 p.m. My plan is to actually do a series of workshops where we're going to try out all the exercises in the book. But that's going to be a couple of weeks from now. Today, you can come and figure out whether you want to whether it's worth trying to see what this classic style is and what it can do for you. It's the style, the most prominent people who use the style are people like Mark Twain, Thomas Jefferson in writing of Declaration of Independence, science writings of Newton on optics, Lavoisier on elements, Faraday on his experiments, is that style, which is very much down to earth. It gives you a feel that somebody is just talking to you individually about some things that you can see, and then takes you to a very high conceptual level naturally from there. And this book is about what that is, what that style is, and then how to build it into your writing, into your speaking, into your thinking. So that's what the book is about. All right, folks, so very excited about the start of Faust. And thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much, Doug, and Brian, and Maritza, and Allison, and Joe. Just great. Thank you, everybody. And everybody who participated. Really like the comments of Myron and Jay. Just great comments. So we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.